for having me today. I'll just set up my screen sharing. Here we go. So I hope you can still see my slide and hear myself as before.
Yes, we can.
Yes, so brilliant. So as Edwina has already said, I would like to talk to you today about why attachment matters in social neuroscience. And just to give you very little context, so I'm a lecturer in psychology at the University of Essex here in Colchester. And I study the neurobiological basis of human relationships, caregiving and attachment. And with a few very dear colleagues, we have recently proposed first models, neuroanatomical models of organized and disorganized attachment. And I hope that towards the end of the talk, I can tell you a little bit about these. But before reaching that point, I think I should provide you with a little bit of context. And I would like to start by saying that most recently, I have realized that attachment theory and attachment is almost everywhere. So if we, for example, go on social media, we can see many posts on different channels from Instagram to Facebook to Twitter to other channels that are talking about attachment and attachment theory. And there are many actually dedicated channels from people who are working in these domains, but also just blogging about these domains and sharing their opinions and views on these domains. Attachment is also quite prominent in the media these days. So, for example, regarding the situation in Ukraine, where families had to be separated because the fathers, the grandfathers, the partners had to stay in the country and the other family members had to leave. Attachment theory is also quite prominently featured in contemporary books, be it scientific books, but also books for the general public. Not only here in the UK, but also quite in other countries in Europe and maybe also in the US and Asia. Attachment theory figures very prominently in education. So, for example, in university education, in undergraduate courses. And here in the UK, and as I have just learned, probably a bit more prominently in Scotland, there is a lot of attachment theory actually being influencing schools and the curriculum there and how interactions in schools are actually laid out. And finally, we have organizations like Scottish Attachment in Action who are actively promoting the importance of attachment and the message that attachment really matters for everybody. And this, as we can see, the success of attachment theory linked to its presence overall and everywhere is, of course, based on the success of attachment theory since it was first described by Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby about 70 years ago. And the success is reflected in the fact that attachment theory is one of the most comprehensive current psychology frameworks around. And it is so successful because it describes very fundamental things in human life for the human existence, namely individual differences in how we form and maintain close social bonds throughout the lifespan. Attachment is so important because it has a very crucial function for our survival in early life, because without forming attachment bonds, which are emotional bonds that can endure for the entire life, that are formed with a special set of people, and especially those people who are likely to offer protection and care, those bonds are necessary for our survival in infancy, but they keep being necessary throughout the whole life because they also govern our relationships with peers, with friends, with romantic partners, with grandparents. So it's really a central aspect of our human existence. And more specifically related to childhood, it is now well established with several meta-analyses that attachment crucially influences social, cognitive, and emotional development, and that this, of course, then translates into bodily and mental health issues across the lifespan. So attachment is really important for humans, and that's, of course, also why it is so prominently featured in all of these outlets that I have recently mentioned. Now, we have to appreciate that attachment theory has traditionally examined certain relationships with a fixed set of methods. So when we look at more traditional attachment methods, we can see that there have been 3 of those methods that have been most prominently used. And the first of those methods is behavioral observation. And the classical example that I have depicted here is the strength situation procedure, where the behavior of infants during a specific sequence of interactions with their parents, mostly the mother, and strangers is observed behaviorally. We have another set of traditional methods that is based on interviews. And here we have the classical example of the adult attachment interview, or the AAI, performed, as the name already says, in adults. But there are also interview procedures that are done in infants and adolescents, for example, the child attachment interview, or other a bit more playful procedures like the story stem battery, where children have to recreate, tell story endings by using play figures. And both of these methods come from a developmental psychology tradition. And the third method, which has also been around for quite some while, is based on self-reports. And here, for example, we have the experiences in close relationships questionnaire that is quite widely used. And this tradition comes more from the social psychology tradition and is mostly applied in adults because it uses self-reports that are not so well suited to do attachment research in children. Now, what we are suggesting is that besides those traditional attachment methods, there might be a fourth approach that can be used to study attachment. And this fourth approach is relating to social neuroscience. It is relating to the question of what are the neurobiological bases of attachment. Now, of course, you might ask yourself, we have all of those well-established traditional methods of behavioral observation, interviews, and self-reports. So what does social neuroscience add that we don't already know? And that's the big question that I'm asked oftentimes. And to illustrate this, I would like to give you an example of one of the first studies that not only used those traditional attachment methods, but also used social neuroscience methods. And this study was conducted in 1993, so quite a while ago, by Spangler and Grossmann in Germany. And what those 2 authors did is they looked at the strength situation paradigm in infants, and they evaluated the infant's behavior as it's classically done through behavioral observation. But what they for the first time also did is that they added 2 social neuroscience methods, namely on the one hand, a physiological measurement of the infant's heart rate and an endocrinological measurement of the infant's cortisol level from saliva samples. And the cortisol level is important because it is the primary stress hormone that is secreted when we become stressed. So what did those authors observe when they looked at those 3 variables? Now, on one hand, when they looked at the behavioral pattern, so the behavioral observation, and they focused specifically on insecure avoidant infants, they found what other people have already described before, namely that insecure avoidant infants showed less overt distress after short separations from their mothers, which is the usual pattern that we associate with deactivating attachment strategies and less distress manifestation in the behavior. However, when the authors then looked at insecure avoidant infants' heart rate, they found something different, namely that the heart rate resembled secure children. And this is depicted here in the figure, where you can see that the secure children here with the black squares had a slight increase in the heart rate during the strength situation paradigm, and that the insecure avoidant children here with the empty circles followed this pattern pretty closely. Of course, disorganized children had a much stronger increase in heart rate, but what is the central message here is that insecure avoidant infants on the level of their physiology were not that different from secure infants, in the sense that they showed a reaction that indicates increased arousal and increased stress. Now, when the authors then looked at cortisol, this notion was even stronger. So as you can see here, the secure children, shown in black, they didn't show too much of a change in their cortisol response, maybe even a decrease. Whereas the avoidant infants, here shown in red, showed a pattern that resembled quite strongly the disorganized pattern, in the sense that after the strain situation procedure, 15 minutes after and 30 minutes after, they showed quite a strong increase in cortisol levels, which indicates that they were actually biologically stressed, even though they didn't show it on the outside. So when we take these two findings together, we can see that insecure avoidant infants only looked calm on the outside, but on the inside, when we take biological social neuroscience markers, it could be shown that they show a lack of an appropriate distress regulation strategy, and that they are actually quite strongly stressed during this strain situation procedure. So what does this mean? This means that when we take social neuroscience methods and add them to the behavioral observations that are classically used, we can see that we actually gain some value in understanding attachment, because we can see things that we cannot see if we only look from the outside. And this is the first message of social neuroscience, saying that by adding these physiological measurements and these endocrinological measurements, there is a lot of added value towards understanding attachment. However, social neuroscience goes 2 steps further than this. And the first step further is that we say that we shouldn't only look at physiology and endocrinology, but that we also should look at 2 other social neuroscience variables. And one of those variables is brain function, anatomy, and connectivity. So we should be looking into the human brain and to see how attachment is actually orchestrated on the level of brain function, anatomy, and connectivity. And social neuroscience also says that we should be looking at the genetics and the epigenetics of attachment. So how attachment is transmitted from one generation to the next, and what the role is of nature versus nurture, and how the nature and the nurture actually interact with each other. And this can be very nicely done when we look at genetics and epigenetics. So this is the first additional step that social neuroscience suggests. The second additional steps is saying that even though social neuroscience can be seen as adding value to understanding attachment, we would rather think that it is more than that. It is not just adding value, but it is actually necessary to fully understand the complex nature of attachment. So we are saying that without having insight from social neuroscience methods, we cannot actually fully understand what attachment is and how the attachment behavior manifests itself and why it manifests itself. So if we illustrate this a little bit visually, we are saying that in order to fully understand attachment, we shouldn't only base ourselves on behavioral observations, interviews, and self-reports, but we also need to take into account all of these other social neuroscience methods so that we can get a comprehensive picture. The most important thing here, however, is that social neuroscience is not saying that we don't need the traditional methods. So behavioral observation, self-report, and interviews are fundamental and integral parts of understanding attachment, but they should be combined with other methods, okay? And we think that this is extremely important because right now within the field of attachment, there is a strong discussion about some of the initial core hypotheses and some of the mechanisms. And this has been nicely summarized in a recent book edited by Ross Thompson, Jeffrey Simpson, and Lisa Berlin, that lays out fundamental questions in attachment, and in this specific case, at least nine fundamental questions in attachment research. And I cannot go into too many details about those questions, but I can just illustrate a few of them to give you an idea. So one question, for example, is what constitutes an attachment relationship? So which qualities does somebody have to have in order to be an attachment figure? How long does it take for somebody to become an attachment figure? And what happens if we already have one or two attachment figures and somebody else enters our life? Will then this person become an attachment figure and another attachment figure will be substituted? Or how does this work in terms of combining with each other? The second question is, what is the best way to measure attachment or attachment security? And here, of course, we have this strong discussion between developmental psychologists and social psychologists, already within those traditional methods, right? The self-reports, the observations, and the interviews. But we are saying, of course, yeah, maybe we can have some other methods to measure attachment security based on social neuroscience, for example. Another question is, what are internal working models and how do they operate? Which is quite an open question, actually, even though this maybe seems a little bit strange because internal working models are integral parts of attachment theory, but there's actually quite a big discussion what these internal working models actually are and what kind of constructs they involve. The next question is about the stability of attachment. So whether early attachments are kept for a long time and whether they are actually changeable or not. And I think there has been quite a strong development recently saying that attachment actually does change, and it can change quite on a short time scale as well, even though some other patterns can be quite stable and remain for very long durations. And finally, there are some other questions. For example, what is the role of culture? Because we know that attachment theory has been developed in weird cultures like Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So we also need to take into account more research from other cultural backgrounds. And finally, there also is the question about attachment interventions. What are attachment interventions? What kind of different interventions are there, and how do they work? And we think that to answer all of these questions, we need to also have information from social neuroscience, because otherwise we only see part of the picture and it will be difficult to answer some of these questions. Right, so we have been talking about social neuroscience now for quite a while. So social neuroscience was kind of the elephant in the room for maybe the last 10 minutes of my presentation. So I think now it's really time to delve a little bit more concretely into this topic and to actually ask ourselves, okay, so what is the social neuroscience of attachment and what are we actually doing and how are we approaching the biological basis of attachment? And to do so, I would like to base the rest of my talk on two of our models that we have recently suggested. And I would like to start with our model that we call NAMA, which is the functional neuroanatomical model of organized human attachment that we have proposed about 1.5 to 2 years ago with a set of colleagues from Germany, the Netherlands, and from Israel. And just to situate this model a little bit into our framework of the social neuroscience of attachment, what I'll be telling you about right now is mainly about this part. So it is about the brain basis of attachment. So the anatomy, the function, and the connectivity within the brain, even though the social neuroscience of attachment includes other elements. But I'll be mainly focusing on the neural aspect, the brain aspect of attachment. And in doing so, I will try to convey the message that on a neural level, on the brain level, attachment can be understood by taking into account 4 principal processes or 4 principal modules within the brain. And I will describe them in more detail in just a second, but just to prepare you for that, we will be talking about aversion, about negative events, about fear, about pain that we will localize in certain areas of the brain. We will then be talking about approach or reward, about positive emotions, about pleasant experiences, and we will situate them within the brain, depicted here in green. Then we will be talking about regulation, about emotion regulation, co-regulation by others, but also self-regulation, here depicted in blue, and we will also situate this within the brain. And finally, we will talk about mental state representations, about mentalizing, about internal working models, here depicted in orange. And we will also be situating this within the human brain. But to make this clearer, I would like to put those elements into a sequence and show you that those elements are crucial parts of everyday attachment interactions that we have with others. And we call this the prototypical attachment pathway, but yeah, this is just the specific denomination we chose in NAMA. So what does a prototypical or a normal attachment interaction, for example, between an infant and a caregiver involve? And as for attachment theory in general, we say that an attachment interaction usually starts when there is an important external or internal event that significantly challenges us and that upsets our bodily and our psychological, our emotional balance. And we say, as other theorists say, that this triggers attachment behavior, we say that this actually triggers a neural attachment system. This triggers a change in the physiology and in the brain because we realize that something significant is happening and that we have to do something about it. And this realization that something is happening is usually linked to threat detection and the fear response, because the most salient information from the environment or from our internal milieu that comes to us is usually there when something is upsetting us, where something is scaring us, where something is making us worry. So this is actually a signal to our body or within our body that something very significant is happening and that we have to do something about it. And we localize these kind of neurobiological processes in a network of brain areas that we call the aversion module. But this can also be understood as a saliency module or something that is encoding negative experiences like fear or pain or threat. Now, we then say that once we realize that something is happening that needs attention, and mostly it's something that is upsetting us, the primary attachment response, of course, is to look for support in others, to reach out, to tell others, hey, something is bothering me, I need your help. And we link this to an approach module because we approach others in order to obtain support and help. So we will be actively looking for others' presence and responsiveness. And we think that this is maintained on a neural level by a so-called approach module, or we could also call this a reward module, because these neural computations, they are linked with intrinsic representations of others as being supportive, as being helpful, as being there for us if we need them. And that's why, of course, we reach out to them if we feel distressed. If we represent others as not being available or not being responsive, then we will not reach out to them. Importantly, if we can establish this social interaction, that's when social regulation can happen. That's when co-regulation can happen. So if we need others' help, we reach out for them. And if they are available and present, then they can help us deal with our emotions. And early in life, this is mostly maintained by co-regulation because we cannot regulate by ourselves. But the older we get, the more we can also learn to self-regulate. But we can only learn to self-regulate if we have learned how to do so through regulation by others, through co-regulation. And if this regulation is successful, then we can return back to our balance, right? We don't have to worry about anymore. We can calm down, our body calms down. And this is something that is usually quite a pleasant experience, right? The fear disappears, the stress disappears, our heart doesn't beat very quickly anymore. So we just relax, and this is something positive as such. But because we experience these positive emotions by interacting with others, we start associating these positive experiences with others, with the presence of others, with the helpfulness of others. And we one more time encode this as a positive experience. We link others with pleasant experiences, with calming down, with reward. And that's exactly why we think that this one more time happens in this approach module, in this reward module within the brain. Now, if this sequence repeats itself many times and consistently, then the final component of attachment can establish itself, namely mental state representations. And in attachment terms, it's basically the internal working models. And on a neural basis, we think that the internal working models are nothing else than predictions and expectations about ourselves, about our capacity to elicit help if we need it, and about the availability and the responsiveness of others. So if I need help, how can I signal it efficiently, and are others going to be there for me or not? So very simple computations on a neural level related to predictions and expectations. And we link this to a fourth module, which we call mental state representation module. Sometimes this has already also been described as the default mode network, but we think that by calling it mental state representation model, it is more easily understandable in terms of attachment. Now, very importantly, once these mental states representations are created, once these internal working models of attachment are created, they will then, of course, influence all of the other preceding components. So they will influence how we react to threats. They will influence how whether we look for support or not, whether we can regulate or not, and whether we encode social interactions with others as pleasant and not. And this is exactly when individual differences of attachment emerge, right? Because these are basically differences in internal working models that are then influencing our behavior in different situations. And I would just very briefly like to illustrate this in terms of attachment avoidance. So we know that the internal working models of attachment avoidance involve the perception that others are unavailable if we need them, that they will not help us because they will either just ignore us or they will not be there in the first place. And that we need to be therefore self-reliant, that we have to deal with negative experiences by ourselves, or even better, we shouldn't have these negative experiences in the first place, because if we don't feel bad about something, we don't have to regulate it. And if we don't have to regulate it, then we don't have to look for help. So if we have those kind of mental states, we will try to avoid situations where we will strongly emotionally activate it, so that we don't have to actually get into a state where we need help. But if we get into those situations, we'll then probably not really approach others for support because we predict them to be unavailable. And if we do so, then we will also probably need more resources to self-regulate, because if others are unavailable, if we are in a negative state, then the only option we have is to self-regulate. And finally, of course, if we don't have those positive experiences with others that help us regulate, then we will probably keep self-regulating because there is nothing that breaks this pattern. And this, of course, will then influence each of those different things will then also influence the components by itself. So there will be many different cross influences that make us behave in a certain way, as for example, when we are avoidantly attached. And we summarized all of these in our paper, and I don't want to go into too many details, but I would maybe just show you a couple of these findings to illustrate my point, namely that when we look at the approach module and the functioning of the approach module related to attachment avoidance, we can see quite a few changes that implicate that people with an avoidant attachment style really represent others on a neural level as less rewarding, as interactions with others as less pleasant and less likely to be something that you really want to seek out. And this on the different levels of the social neuroscience. We also see that if we have avoidantly attached participants, that the co-regulation by others actually really is less efficient. So if they are in a negative state, they actually prefer to be alone, because if they are surrounded by others, then this negativity might actually even be increased rather than decreased. And finally, we found that because avoidantly attached individuals assume that they have to regulate distress and to face challenges by themselves, that they actually upregulate their bodily resources in a sense that they have higher baseline glucose levels. So their body is actually always in a slightly increased physiological state in order to be able to face any challenges on their own, because they need their own resources to do so. And I think this is really interesting and gives us a very nice overall picture in terms of the social neuroscience of attachment, which is based on another theory that I really like, that is the social baseline theory that was proposed a couple of years ago by two researchers from the US. And what basically, in a nutshell, does this tell us about attachment? It tells us that it is our bodies and our brains' default state to assume and to predict that others are available, because our brain sees the resources of other people as if they were our own resources. Because then if I have a problem, I don't have to worry about the problem by myself. I can just approach somebody else and we can deal with the problem together. So my load is halved, or even more strongly reduced, because I can share my worries and my sorrows with others, and they can give me their resources to feel better again. Now, what happens if those social resources are removed, or if we feel as if they were removed? For example, if we feel lonely. And of course, we know that we can feel lonely even though there are many people around us. So it's really this subjective experience of feeling lonely. Well, if we are in such a state, there will be compensatory mechanisms kicking in. So we have to compensate for the lack or the perceived lack of others. And how do we do so? We do so by adopting secondary strategies. And in attachment terms, these secondary strategies are nothing else than an avoidance strategy and an anxious strategy. So either we upregulate our support-seeking attempts because we want to be connected to others, and if we don't feel like we are, we actively look for this connection, or we downregulate our social support-seeking attempts, but at the same time upregulate our own resources to deal with stress by ourselves. And this is nothing else. And very importantly, nothing else than attachment avoidance or attachment anxiety. And very importantly, this is environmentally adaptive. This is meaningful. We need to do that, because if we don't do so, we are in trouble, right? So this really conveys the message that attachment avoidance and anxiety as such are not bad things. On the short term, this is actually really useful, and it helps us to deal with this impression that we are alone and that we are disconnected from others. Unfortunately, if we feel so for a long time or very strongly, then of course we start to get into chronic allostasis overload, into a state where we are just too strongly downregulating or too strongly upregulating, and this unfortunately represents risk factors in terms of the development of attachment disorganization, or also in the emergence of physical and mental health issues. So these mechanisms are meaningful and adaptive on a short term, but they become maladaptive if they are maintained for a too long time, if they are too strong, or if they are generalized outside of the context within which they appeared, within which they are adaptive. And this brings me to our second model, namely the functional neuroanatomical model of disorganized attachment, where we try to extend the considerations that I have just told you about to attachment disruption and attachment disorganization, because so far we were always concerned with attachment, with organized attachment, either secure or insecure, avoidant, insecure, anxious. So we are trying to think about what happens if early life experiences are much more adverse and involve traumatic events, or if attachment becomes disrupted or disorganized later through traumatic events during later in life, and whether we can actually also look at such patterns on a biological and brain level. And we think that this is important because even though typical rates of disorganized attachment are not extremely high, there are at-risk groups where the proportion of disorganized attachment can very quickly become very, very large, going to 30, 40, even 90%. So it's really something that we also have to consider, and we have to consider it separately, because it is likely something that is not just easily deducible from organized attachment. And this comes from where in our model are we situating these kinds of contexts. So we can, for example, say that in disorganized attachment, the caregiver, him or herself, is a source of threat, or the needs of the infant are neglected. There is nobody available when they need help and support. Or a child might not have consistent caregivers, for example, when the child is institutionalized or when it has to change institutions for several times in a short succession, so that it cannot really have a reliable, consistent attachment figure. Now, there are several challenges regarding the neuroanatomical model of disorganization, and I would just like to mention a few very briefly, namely that so far, we think that there is a great lack of specificity, namely that different adverse experiences are lumped together, although they are very likely to have very specific effects on neurobiological mechanisms. So, for example, only talking about institutionalization is quite unspecific, because different individuals can have very different experiences while being institutionalized, and some of those experiences might be much more or less adverse. Some could actually even be positive, because it's something that helps the child to reestablish attachment security. Also, what we are seeing is that attachment disorganization should not just be seen as a simple continuation of insecurity, because some of the manifestations on a neurobiological level are quite specific. So we cannot just say that disorganization is just more or less of anxiety or avoidance within the brain. We really have to specifically look at samples with disorganization. What is also extremely important is that not all adverse childhood experiences or early life experiences that are adverse lead to insecure attachment or attachment disorganization, right? You can have disorganized attachment in infants that don't have any experiences in maltreatment, for example, or neglect or abuse. But you can, on the other hand, you can have no attachment disorganization in children who have been abused or neglected, because it's heavily context dependent how these things play together. So again, we have to be extremely careful. And finally, there is only extremely limited evidence on the neurobiology of attachment disorganization. So we cannot really draw any conclusions as of yet, and we need much more data in larger samples, ideally longitudinal samples, to really come to a conclusion here. So this is still very much work in progress, and something that we are actively working on and trying to elaborate on to provide more insights, like, for example, for NAMA, where there is more evidence already available and more evidence accumulating almost every month or so. All right, we are almost at the end of my talk, and I would just like to give you a glimpse into two recent developments in the social neuroscience of attachment that I have come across and been involved in recently. And the first of these two recent developments is an increased focus on dads. So attachment theory has been, and research has been quite strongly focused on mothers. But more recently, we are seeing that research is also involving fathers and maybe even entire families with dads and moms likewise. And this reflects the fact that during the last 50 years or so, there have been worldwide societal changes in which the fathers have been increasingly more involved in childcare activities. So, for example, in the US, in 2016, dads were almost 3 times more involved in childcare. They spent almost 3 times more time in childcare than they did about 50 years earlier. And very similar patterns have been observed in other countries in Europe, including also the UK. And this is also reflected in attachment theory that has quite strongly evolved over the course of the last 50, 60 years. Because when Bowlby first postulated attachment theory, fathers were not even mentioned. So fathers were really not present in attachment theory at that point of time. Maybe about 10 years later or so, this has been really addressed for the first time in sense of by asking the question, can fathers actually serve as attachment figures? And if so, what is their role? Are they only secondary or maybe even tertiary? And how does this role relate to the mother? And since then, it has become evident that, yes, fathers can be attachment figures, and they are actually quite important attachment figures. The question then turned much more into the hierarchy of attachment relationships. So which attachment figure is most important? Is it the mom, or could it also be the dad? And what about other attachment figures? And this then turned into the question of comparative quality of attachments of infants to the mom and to the father. So is the quality of attachment always the same, or is it different? And what does it mean to have different attachments to mom and dad? And finally, since the 1990s, we are really in investigating the differential developmental outcomes of attachments between fathers and mothers, because we appreciate that moms and dads are different and that children develop different attachments to moms and dads, and that these different attachments might actually have different developmental functions. However, despite those societal changes and those notions in attachment theory, social neuroscience research on dads is still lagging very, very strongly behind. So when I looked for the number of social neuroscience studies on moms on the left and on dads on the right from the 1960s to 2022, I was quite astonished to find that there were 5 times fewer studies on the father-child relationship than they were on the mother-child relationship. So we are still lagging very strongly behind there, and much more research has to be done. And of course, since there is such a discrepancy in the findings, we still don't know a lot about the dad's brain, right? So we have quite, well, on the funny side, we have some impressions of what is going on in the dad's brain, right? But we need much more insight and much more research, because we know these days that moms and dads are different, and that moms and dads have different relationships to their children, and have different relationships to their dad and to their mom, and that those differences are meaningful, right? Even though here they are shown a little bit exaggeratedly in a funny way, but these differences are meaningful, and we have to understand those differences. And finally, there is another point that I would like to make, namely, if you remember, I said that social neuroscience needs those 5 aspects to really understand what attachment is. But there is a but in this scheme, namely that most of the research so far in social neuroscience has been done in a first-person social neuroscience perspective, meaning that we have been looking at attachment in isolated individuals, in single individuals, right? In people who are alone in the scanner, who are alone sitting in front of a screen, or who are alone facing some kind of challenge. So it's really being centered on single individuals. And we know these days, of course, and we have known it already from the beginning of attachment theory, that attachment is something that happens between at least 2 people. It is something interpersonal. And this is something that we have to introduce in the social neuroscience of attachment as well. So we have to start looking at least 2 people directly interacting with each other. Otherwise, we cannot really understand the dynamics of attachment between 2 or more people. And we are doing this these days by scanning the brains of 2 people at the same time and looking at synchrony, how those brains synchronize with each other. So what I want to say is that we actually need another element here. We need the element of synchrony, of 2 interacting people directly. So this adds more complexity, but I also think that it adds much more depth and understanding to the whole equation. And we are doing this these days by looking at mothers and fathers playing together with their children, for example, by solving puzzles and by measuring brain activity from both of them, and by also looking at the interaction quality and the attachment of the child to the parent, and the caregiving beliefs of the parents. And this is something very new and exciting, and we hope that we can even better understand attachment by doing so. And I don't have time anymore to say too much about this, but I want to say just one thing, namely that more synchrony is not always better. It can also be detrimental, because we can also synchronize in negative ways with each other. So we should just not associate synchrony always with something good. All right. To finish, I would just like to say that one big aim of our work is to provide information to everybody, especially to parents, to practitioners, to psychiatrists, psychologists. So we want to translate our findings into something that is useful for as many other people as possible. And one thing that we have done and that I'm very happy about is to publish a book for parents. And this book was published by the UK charity Baby Grow, that tries to describe in very simple words how our neuroanatomical model of attachment can inform parents, how our baby's brains develop, and how responsive communication between parent and baby can lead to later life mental health and well-being. And this book is completely free. It can be downloaded if you go to Baby Grow and just register there. And I think it's really wonderful because it illustrates in very nice terms, and by rephrasing some of our findings, by simplifying some of our findings, and showing how this relates to very practical issues of communicating with babies, and then also links it to attachment styles. So if you feel like this might be something that would be useful for you, please feel free to check this out and to get back to me or back to the Baby Grow people who came up with this nice idea, and to spread the word, because as I said, it's completely free. So it's really something that is out there for everybody. And if you feel like my talk was interesting and you would like to learn a little bit more, then please feel free to check out my website, where I have a few blogs. I also was invited to write a blog for Scottish Attachment in Action. Thank you very much for that. I have some Instagram pages and Facebook accounts for my lab and for myself. So feel free to check this out, to get in touch with me there. I'm also very happy to say that I was given the opportunity to give a TEDx talk on caring dads, the making of involved and confident fathers, and this has just been released a couple days ago. So feel free to check this out as well. And finally, if you want to learn a little bit more, you're also invited to look at the Society for Emotion and Attachment Studies website. That is an organization dedicated to understanding attachment and to explore that further. And yeah, without any further ado, I would like to thank my collaborators, without whom all of this work that I have presented today wouldn't have been possible. And as you can see, it's quite an international bunch of very nice people, and I hope I can keep working with them in the future. And I would like to thank you very, very much for your attention and for giving me the opportunity to be here today. And I'm happy to take your questions.
Pascal.
Yes.
Thank you. I don't know whether you can see me.
Yes, I can see
you. Okay, yeah. Wow. My mind is absolutely buzzing, Pascal.